I'm good. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to have you back on. And there are a whole bunch of topics and things that happened since the last time that we spoke. I mean, let's start with the biggest, I suppose, which is the Nord Stream pipeline attacks. I know some people like to call them mysterious leaks. I mean, it's not really that mysterious, but I wanted to get your take on it. Just what do you think happened, and who was behind it? Because the German, Russian, Swedish, and Danish governments have all said this is not a natural occurrence. It's obviously man-made, and it was sabotage.
Well, I mean, I think the Russians concur. The Russians have sent their own investigation capabilities there, and they've reported that there are 3 to 5 meter deep craters directly underneath the destroyed section of the pipelines, which are completely destroyed. So this is obviously a man-made event. Um, what do I think happened? I think the United States ordered it. Whether or not it was executed by American assets or British assets, frankly, is irrelevant. The bottom line is one NATO ally attacked another. This was a German strategic energy infrastructure. Yes, it was 51% owned by Gazprom. Yes, it was Russian gas in there, but it was produced to benefit Germany and Europe, and it was destroyed most likely by the United States or somebody acting with the permission of the United States. I mean, if I were a prosecutor, I could convict on circumstantial evidence alone. Just simply, I'd say, what's the intent? And I'd just play Joe Biden's comments on February 7th, where he said, if Russian tanks go into Ukraine, he will terminate Nord Stream 2. When asked, even though this means it's German infrastructure, he said it will end. So
Hmm.
we have a statement of intent. He asked the question, who benefits? Cui bono? We have Anthony Blinken's, the Secretary of State's statement that this is a great opportunity. I mean, when your ally, close allies, critical infrastructure, I mean, the critical infrastructure for the sustainability of the German economy is destroyed, one would imagine that there would be words of condolence that this would
Hmm.
be difficult, that America promises to provide liquid natural gas at a price that won't bankrupt Germany. But instead, this is a tremendous opportunity for Europe and the United States. And we've seen how this opportunity has manifested itself with the United States selling liquid natural gas at prices much higher than that which Europe was paying for Russian gas. It's
Right.
bankrupting Europe. French companies are shutting down, German companies are shutting down. Um, Everything. And the last thing is means. We know that the United States and NATO carried out training exercises involving underwater unmanned vehicles, demining vehicles. That means they have explosive warheads on them in this very area, right where these pipelines were attacked. And in the past, they have found some of these drones right underneath the pipeline. I think in 2015, they found one of these drones,
Really?
uh, Seafox, they call it, underneath a Nord Stream 1 pipeline. I think the Swedes know who did it. I think the Danes know who did it. I think the Germans know who did it. We know the Americans know who did it because they did it. And I think the Russians know who did it. It's not just the craters, but I'm fairly certain that the Russians, knowing how to do forensic investigations of this nature, would have taken samples from the seabed. Those samples will contain residue of the high explosive charges used, and they will be able to trace that high explosive charge back to the nation of production. So it's with 100% certainty that Russia knows who did it, and Russia has made it clear they say it's the Anglo-Saxons that have done it, the Americans and the British.
Yeah, the Russian Foreign Ministry have been saying in the last couple of days that it's very clear that we did it. So I mean, they pointed the finger specifically at the UK. And when you read about it in the press, they say though that these claims are unsubstantiated. Well, what you make of that, and the British role?
Well, I mean, the British have been very aggressive in their support for Ukraine. So it wouldn't surprise me if the British would take a lead in doing something of this nature. It gives the United States a modicum of deniability. Um, the British are also involved in the underwater drone attack on the Russian naval base in Sevastopol, at least according to the Russians, who captured one of the drones um, and have other intelligence that points to British involvement. the United Kingdom has always, punched above its weight. I think they're doing so now. I don't know what the repercussions will be, but Russia's made it clear that there will be repercussions. This is very dangerous because repercussions against a NATO country that's protected by Article 5 raises the possibility of an escalation of conflict. And where you're dealing with nuclear armed powers, you can never totally discount the possibility of nuclear war. So, you have to ask yourself, to what end did they do this? Why did they do this? Clearly, it's not in Europe's economic benefit to do this. I mean, England itself is undergoing somewhat of a crisis right now related to energy and the costs of energy. Germany is condemned now. They will not have the ability to get through this winter unscathed. There will be blackouts. People will suffer. Industries will shut down. The liquid natural gas that's being provided by the United States is neither sufficient in quantity or affordability for Europe. We see France and Germany right now condemning the United States for these high energy costs. This is just stupidity writ large. There's no reason for this. Europe's economic health is largely derived from the fact that they have for decades now been able to sustainably gain access to Russian energy that's cheaper than the market rate. And so they've been able to save hundreds of billions, if not trillions of euros over the years. And this savings has manifested itself in a high standard of living, good medical, free education. And Europe just shot themselves in the foot. Without this cheap Russian energy, they can't afford anything. They can't afford to keep businesses open, which means they have a depressed tax base, which means they have large unemployment, which means they can't afford this government subsidized lifestyle anymore. It makes no sense, purely to appease the American hegemon. I mean, that's what is here. Europe is basically willing to commit suicide to please their American masters, and this makes no sense.
Scott, you used to be a weapons inspector at the United Nations, and I wanted to ask you, what do you make of this Russian claim that's come forward in the last week or two that there was a plan by the Ukrainians to plant a dirty bomb? I'll just read one quote from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog based in Vienna. They said that, quote, based on the evaluation of the results available to date and the information provided by Ukraine, the agency did not find any indications of undeclared nuclear activities and materials at the locations. So, bit of a contradiction there. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that if you give a nation who wants to hide something significant advance notice, that you're not going to find anything. I mean, that's just that. That doesn't mean that Ukraine's guilty. It just means that the IEA's investigation doesn't withstand sufficient scrutiny. Having said that, I am not one who is buying that Ukraine was seriously pursuing this option. I'm not just a former weapons inspector, I'm a former intelligence officer. And I have deconstructed scenarios, intelligence-based scenarios in the past, trying to ascertain what sources were used to create the report in question. It appears to me that there's two primary sources. One is a source that is linked to the presidency of Ukraine, but not directly linked. It's not a source next to the president. Why do I say that? Because Russia would never release any information that came from a source that close to the president of Ukraine. You put the source at risk. This source is several layers removed from the president, but it's clear that somebody has access to information about presidential level discussions of great importance. And so that's a piece of information that would would have relatively low value by itself because it's so far removed, it becomes almost a rumor. Then you attach to that some very specific information about various industries that are involved, companies that are involved, and the specific nature of the discussions about that implies intercepted phone calls. Whether they're complete conversations or snippet of conversations, I don't know. But when you tie that intelligence in uh, people sometimes refer to it as chatter. We hear chatter about things. So chatter combined with a source saying that this is being discussed, the president is worthy of a report to Russian leadership from a Russian intelligence officer. Then the Russian leadership has to ask itself, what does it want to do with this? Do you want to sit on it and uh, and if it's true, then deal with the consequences of such an irresponsible Ukrainian action? Or do you want to take action, knowing that the intelligence could be bad, but take action that puts the West on notice that Russia is aware of this possibility and that Russia won't tolerate this possibility, and that Russia is encouraging the West to reach out to Ukraine to ensure that this possibility never becomes probability, never happens. And that's what the Russians did. Shoigu made a number of phone calls to his counterparts in the West. I believe they took these phone calls seriously. I believe that not only did they turn to their own intelligence services to find out if there's any truth to this, but they made phone calls to Zelensky and his inner circle, finding out if this is something that they're pursuing and putting them on notice that the West won't tolerate this, that this is not something that the West would find acceptable. And I think that this telephone diplomacy it worked. First of all, I don't believe that Zelensky was serious about this. I think this might have been something that was being discussed as a potential option on how to get the West to on Ukraine's behalf. But I don't think it was serious. I don't think it had reached the operational phase because even the Ukrainians are stupid enough to do something like this. But I think the Russians could take no chance. They made the phone calls. I think Zelensky was put on notice, and I think this issue has been put to bed.
Right, because that was quite substantial, seeing the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu phoning up, his American counterpart, the British one, the French one. Yeah, that was quite substantial. I don't think that ever happened until now throughout the war.
Not like that, no. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of audacious attacks. What do you make of the Crimea Bridge attack? Because that was another huge event that took place since the last time that you and I spoke. And, on the day that it happened, the Ukrainians practically were, they were glowing and boasting and showing off about it. Zelensky, the SBU. Do you think they were helped with that attack too, with that operation? Because it looks to me now like truck bombs are all the rage. They're in.
Well, again, I mean, we're prisoner to the sources of information that are available. And there's been some information coming out of Russia about what they have uncovered regarding this truck bomb. And you have to take that with a grain of salt. I can't confirm that this information is correct, but let's just act on that. Mm-hmm. Russia claims that the explosives used for this truck bomb left Odessa on a ship that had been cleared to deliver grain. That these explosives made their way eventually to Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, I think Armenia, perhaps.
It was both of them, I recall.
Yeah, and they were configured in a manner to be transported on a truck in Georgia. This configuration involved wrapping the explosives in film to protect it from being detected by X-ray systems, and then the vehicle left and blew up on the bridge. Whether or not the driver was witting of his demise, we don't know. But let's take that apart. Again, this is what I used to do for a living: is take apart stories. Let's assume it's true. Why did the Ukrainians pick that ship? What made that ship attractive? Has Ukraine had a history of smuggling things in and out of Odessa using that ship, or have other nations had experience doing this? Was this, for instance, a smuggling route that has been used by foreign intelligence services? Does Ukraine have the ability to have a reception committee waiting for them in Armenia and in Georgia for these high explosives? Because you don't just make something up like that overnight. It has to exist. And do the Ukrainian services have the intelligence capability in Armenia and the funding necessary to build this network, which remains in place for the potential of something to happen, or did another nation have that capability? Did Ukraine receive help from another nation who said, here, you can use our network, you can use our Georgian network? Um, if you're going to do something like this, I can guarantee you that you don't, first time you drive a truck using the film disguise technique over the bridge isn't during the attack. It means there had to be rehearsals. It means that somebody had to drive this truck over the bridge with something that wasn't a bomb wrapped in film to see if they would get stopped by the Russians or not. You don't, this isn't guesswork. You don't go through all this problem exposing potential, exposing networks, basically
Yeah.
compromising the networks just to be discovered for the attack. So you do rehearsals, and you don't just do one rehearsal, you do several rehearsals to make sure that it's a repeatable event, that you didn't just accidentally get through the first time. I don't know how many rehearsals they would have done, at least 2, maybe 3. But now what we're saying is this is a timely event. I mean, this takes time. So this wasn't something that was just planned today. It's been planned for a long time. And you ask yourself, why did they attack on the day they did? Putin's birthday, very symbolic date. So let's assume that they were attacking on Putin's birthday to score a propaganda victory. That means that this attack was planned well in advance of this. This isn't Ukraine suddenly decide they want to do something. This is an attack that was planned a long time ago, which means that it probably was either the United States or Great Britain were cognizant of this potential, and there's a possibility that one or more of those nations actually helped make this attack a possibility. So this isn't just the Ukrainians acting on their own, that this was something that was facilitated more than likely by the British, because again, we see the British taking the lead on these kind of risky endeavors. So I think that the MI6 was involved. I don't believe the Ukrainians had the intelligence infrastructure in place in the nations necessary to pull this off. I think they were given help by the British, not only to plan this, but to execute this. But now we say, okay, on that day they felt good. They were all taking selfies by the big giant stamp. Ask the Ukrainians how they feel about it now. Because the Russians are driving over the bridge. Russians are sending rail traffic over the bridge. The Russians are repairing the bridge.
Yeah, they fixed it quite quickly.
Ukraine's power grid's out. People are living in the dark, queuing up for water. How many are taking selfies today? How many Ukrainians think that was a good trade-off? I think it was one of the dumbest things Ukraine ever did. And this war is one of the dumbest things Ukraine ever did. So it's just one more dumb thing in a list of dumb things. But this didn't give Ukraine any advantages whatsoever. It's put Ukraine at an extraordinarily disadvantage. It's empowered the Russians with anger, with righteous indignation. I think the Russians are redoubled in their efforts. It didn't weaken Russian resolve. I think Russian resolve has been increased by this. And, the timing. You time this at a time when Russia is building up its strength, putting in a new general who has the ominous nickname of General Armageddon. What did you think a General Armageddon was going to do? Roll over and play dead? No, he's taking out your power grid right now while he's building up his military to defeat you decisively on the field of battle. This was a bad move by Ukraine. They gained momentary propaganda benefit, but strategically, it's brought nothing but bad things for them. It was a dumb move.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the power grid. I guess that was quite clear what it was, right? It was retaliation for the bridge attack, and the
Russians have been wanting to. They've been attacking parts of the power grid for some time now. It's not the first time they've hit power grid, but they've never hit it in this sustained fashion, doing the damage that they've been doing. In the past, they deliberately targeted it in a manner that could allow for rapid reconstitution, sort of sending a signal to the Ukrainians that we can do this. But this time they're attacking in a way that's designed to knock it out. I mean, some aspects can be reconstituted, but by and large, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to rapidly reconstitute the lost capacity, and Russia can double down anytime they want. They can increase the pressure, and there's nothing Ukraine can do to stop it. They don't have any air defense capable of preventing the Russians from finishing the task. One question is this related to the bridge? I can tell you from a targeting standpoint that the Russians already had these targets picked out, had the weapons packages picked out, had the had the attacks planned. They exist in basically a strike folder.
Yeah.
What was the political decision to go forward with this, and I don't know if General Surovikin had already made his mind up. He's been given carte blanche to do anything he wants, minus nuclear weapons. Had he made the decision beforehand to do this, or was he prompted to do this by the attack on the bridge? I don't know. I know it appears to me the Russians would have had this planned out. They would have had the weapons allocated, the targets picked, etc. And whether it's coincidence that they happened on the same date or whether it's related, I don't know. But the bottom line is, I think even if Russia was carrying out these attacks, regardless of the bridge, the duration and the intensity of the attacks, I do believe, is directly related to the bridge attack, that the Russians are pressing the issue a lot more aggressively than they may have had the bridge not been attacked.
Yeah, I agree with you that it points to British work, because the first thing that I thought of when I saw this was, you go back and look at the OSS, you look at F section, the SAS in World War II. This is really the birth of special forces and sabotage in wartime, and going deep behind enemy lines to do this. So I don't know. It's just something the UK has been doing for decades and decades and decades, and kind of pioneered this stuff. So I guess it made sense. And I'm just curious because if we say that the knocking out the power grid, or let's say the intensity of it is in retaliation to the Crimea bridge attack. Well, what about Nord Stream 2? Because if you take the two, I would argue the Nord Stream pipelines are more valuable and more important than the Crimea bridge, but we didn't really see any sort of Russian retaliation for that yet, I suppose. Do you think that's coming, or the Russians are basically just, they're not going to do anything because this is really just Europe destroying itself, so there's no need to do anything? What do you think is going to happen? Because the Russians are now saying it's Britain, but they haven't committed to a response. They said that's still coming.
Well, I think that's the issue. Look, if you allow a bully, and I'm not saying that the British are a bully compared to the Russians, but they're acting like it. If you allow a bully to get away with bullying without consequences, they'll just continue to bully. Nord Stream, from the Russian perspective, Nord Stream looked like it was a dead issue to begin with. The European Union was prohibiting Nord Stream 2 from being turned on, and Nord Stream 1, there was a political game going on with sanctioning and the repaired turbo pumps or pumps and things of that nature.
Right.
So from a strategic standpoint, Russia didn't lose anything in the short term. Maybe they lost some political leverage over Germany. There were some demonstrations breaking out on German cities, which were criticizing the German policy about sanctioning Russian energy, and were encouraging the British to turn on Nord Stream 2. And I think there's a correlation between those demonstrations and the decision to strike, meaning that the United States and their British poodles attack poodles. There's a concept. But they basically, they destroyed something that, isn't going to hurt Russia. It hurt Germany. And so from the Russian perspective, you can let that one slide. I don't think it would go unpunished down the end, but Russia gains more by being the aggrieved party. And everybody knows Russia's the aggrieved party. Maybe the media is not reporting it, but I don't believe there's a person in Europe that's going, no, Russia did this. Russia did this. And it's the Americans who are the good guys on this one. I don't think there's anybody doing that right now. Seriously. I mean, you're in Vienna. Let's go walk around the cafe, sit down with people, say, who do you think took out Nord Stream? And they're going to go, the Americans, you idiot.
They will, yeah.
So they're fooling nobody. And look what the Russians have done. Almost not instantly, but soon thereafter, Russia is now in negotiations with Turkey over building Turk Stream 2, double the Turkish pipeline to turn Turkey into an energy hub to supply gas to Europe.
Sure.
So, they got shut down in the north. They're coming in from the south. And Europe is desperate for Russian gas. They are just desperate for Russian gas, and they're going to get more desperate as time goes on. And there could be some revolutionary transformation in terms of political power in Europe, where we can have the current clique that is anti-Russian energy be replaced by other people who are more realistic about the needs and wants and desires of their respective populations, and suddenly want Russian energy, and Russia's position itself to provide Russian energy. So, sometimes the best response isn't the violent response. Sometimes the best response is the response that actually has you winning. Russia doesn't want to be doing anything that may feel good, because Russia doesn't play the feel good game. Russia's not about, doing something and then Putin comes out and gives a speech about how great I am. I'm Vladimir Putin and I sent commandos to do this. When was the last time Putin gave that speech? Never. But American presidents have to give that all the time. I sent him in to kill Osama bin Laden. I sent him in to kill ISIS. I did this. Here's a photograph showing me sitting around a table looking at a computer while other people do things far away. Aren't I great? Putin doesn't have to play that game. Putin doesn't sit there and say, how do I make myself look good? He just looks good by being competent. So the Russians aren't going to play the, let's feed the mainstream Western media game. They're just going to do what they need to do to prevail. And one of the ways you prevail is not to increase the friction. The Russian goal right now is to have a friction-free policy where things are happening smoothly. You don't want to do things that feel good one day and end up putting a lot of friction in the system the next. Like, for instance, blowing up the Crimea bridge. Feels good, lots of friction. They basically poured sand in the European engine. Good luck getting home from work.
Yeah, that's interesting about Turkey, right? Because Turkey's, at the end of the day, still a NATO member, but they haven't sanctioned the Russians. So how do you think that's going to play out?
Look, Turkey, let me put it this way. The Turkish-Russian relationship should be studied by those who want to figure out how regional geopolitical competitors can peacefully coexist in a time of great tension. Because on the surface, Turkey and Russia should be at war with one another. I mean, they're basically at war in Syria. They're at war with each other in Libya. They're fighting a proxy war in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Turkey's providing weapons to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So if Russia was America, we'd be saying bomb them, sanction them, isolate them, terminate them, eliminate them. Instead, Putin's meeting with Erdogan on a regular basis. They're shaking hands. They're signing multi-billion-dollar energy deals. Russia's completed a nuclear reactor. They're now going to empower Turkey to become an energy hub. This is good. This is good for Erdogan. This is good for his economy. His economy is in the dumps. This energy hub thing has an opportunity to flip that around, strengthen Erdogan, keep him in power. The last thing America do is try and keep somebody in power who's irritating us. We have a tendency to try and overthrow them. Here's the Russians are playing the exact same game. We're going to make Erdogan even more powerful. We're going to make him more influential, and we're not asking him to change anything he's doing in Libya and Syria. We're not making it conditional. We will work with him on these three issues here. We will work with him on Ukraine, but America comes in with conditions on everything. We're going to give you this, but first you have to do this. Russia's saying, you want an energy hub? We'll work with you on the energy hub. And that's it. That's a separate discussion. Ukraine is a separate discussion. This is how adults behave. Russia is an adult. Turkey is an adult. And they are a living example of how two nations who are, regional competitors can compete and cooperate to the mutual benefit of both.
Yeah, and that includes Syria, I suppose, because interestingly enough, in the last month, Turkey is now kind of there's sort of a détente with Syria, right? Which is unusual because Erdogan saying he wanted to meet Bashar al-Assad. I've never heard that in the last 10 years, unless I missed something. But yeah, do you think Russia was also involved in that? Not as imposing it as a condition, but basically just working that with them.
Russian diplomats, surprisingly, um, endorse peaceful outcomes to violent problems. Um, yeah, there's no doubt that Russia was involved, but Russia is involved in talking to Syria, encouraging Assad to soften his stance with Turkey. Russia is involved in talking with Turkey, encouraging them to soften their stance with Syria. Um, the Russians have made it clear to Turkey that there are red lines, and that if Turkey crosses those red lines, that there's the possibility, indeed probability, of direct conflict between Russian troops and Turkish troops. And that's something they'd like to avoid. But Russia neither threatens or backs down. Russia just hits with the reality of the situation. This is the ground truth. This is the facts. Let's find a way to solve this problem. But oh, by the way, want to cooperate? We're going to put this to the side. This has nothing to do with what we're getting ready to talk about. Now we can sit down and say, hey, we have no issues on energy. Why don't we work together? How do we let's sign this agreement? Oh, wait a minute, Libya. Yeah, here we got a problem with Libya. You see, we want to do this, that, and the other thing. You want to do that. We are encouraging a peaceful outcome. Oh, wait, Syria just blew up. Let's bring it back. Yeah, a little bit of fighting here. We had to bomb some of your troops. We don't want to escalate. Why don't we figure a way to back down? Oh, let's get back to it. Russia can go all over the map and be consistent in each one because there's no conditions attached. Whereas the United States can't do that because everything we do is conditional. We can't focus on this because we've sanctioned here, we've isolated here, we've done this here, and that's why our diplomacy fails. We haven't succeeded in anything recently. I just challenge somebody to say this is where America's had a wonderful diplomatic outcome. I struggle to find it because we can't win when we impose unrealistic conditions on the world. Russia, on the other hand, has had success after success after success after success because Russia imposes no conditions. They deal with everything in isolation and they deal with it realistically and responsibly. And here's the most important thing, with due respect to the people that they're negotiating with. The United States doesn't waltz into Turkey with respect. We waltz in and say, hey, we'll deny you F-35. We're going to sanction you. Hey, you got to do this. You're crazy about this. And the Turks are like, we don't need to hear this. This is not how you treat, a nation of the stature of Turkey. But we don't recognize that. We say you're a NATO ally, and don't you know what that means? Totally subservient to the United States. A NATO ally must behave as the compliant poodle that you are. When America says sit, you must sit. When we say jump, you say jump how high. We don't want a dog, when we say sit, behaves like my dog Maverick and just runs around and does whatever the heck he wants anytime he wants. We don't like that. Russia, on the other hand, respects dogs like Maverick and says, well, that's just a dog being a dog. So, and I'm not calling Turkey a dog. I don't want anybody to misconstrue it. I'm saying I try to have a little.
I didn't even think of that. Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. I understand what you're saying. Maverick's a cool name. So, I speaking of diplomacy, I'm gonna get to that in a second, but just quickly, I want to ask you, what do you think about the 101st Airborne and other units in or near Ukraine? So these are the reports now that, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but I have to ask you nevertheless.
Well, the first thing I thought when I heard about it is the Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, because that's literally what's happening here is America's holding the hands of panicked Eastern European countries. We sent the 82nd Airborne into Poland shortly, when this crisis was first evolving, and they were holding Polish hands. Now we have the 101st Airborne in Romania, and they're holding Romanian hands. And it's purely just a feel-good moment. We're saying, hey, we're here for you. We're not going to abandon you. If the evil Russians come over the border, we're ready to help you defend yourself and all that. And if I were the Romanians, I'd say, okay, hey, thanks, man. That's pretty cool. But light infantry, really? Light infantry. Because when I take a look at what you've deployed, you got a lot of really cool helicopters, but I also know they have some of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems in the world. Are they really going to survive? And then let's say they do, and you get those troops deployed on the ground. Light infantry. Yeah, I just want to ask the question. Light infantry, because there's a lot of tanks over there. And light infantry don't do well against tanks in isolation. And I'm looking around and I don't see the heavy Army armored brigades backing up the 101st Airborne or the 82nd. I know there's one in Europe and it's running around doing stuff. There might be two now. Who knows? But no, this is purely a presence mission. It's designed to score political points on behalf of the United States with the nations where these troops are. It's a tripwire, meaning that if you have 4,700 American troops in Romania, that the Russians might think twice before sending their forces across the border, just like the battle groups in the Baltics and the Poland. They have them there. You're not going to have 4,000 NATO troops in Latvia defeat a Russian military incursion, but they can deter a Russian military incursion because of the Article 5 consequences that are accrued, which is why Russia will never invade Romania, never invade Poland. And this is why the presence of American troops is, in many ways, superfluous. It's meaningless. The Russians are, I mean, they're aware of it, but I don't think the Russians are losing too much sleep over the 101st Airborne Division being in Romania because, practically speaking, it doesn't pose a meaningful threat to Russia. If the United States were to go into Ukraine, they would be stripped of their Article 5 protection. And these troops would be by themselves on the ground and subjected to termination with extreme prejudice, to quote Apocalypse Now.
Scott, I'm sure you heard Joe Biden's remarks that we're the closest to nuclear war that we've ever been since 1962, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you agree with that assessment? And how real is the danger of nuclear confrontation? And why do you think people are not taking that seriously enough?
The Cuban Missile Crisis, let's put things in perspective, first of all. I think Russia in 1962 had 4 intercontinental ballistic missiles that had to be refueled, put up in Plesetsk, and I think one other place they could have launched them from. With a single warhead, these missiles may or may not have worked. And who knows where they would have landed. But just big warheads, so it would have gone boom somewhere. They also had a number of tactical nuclear weapons, including some they deployed into Cuba that could have been put on these SS-4, SS-5 missiles. And they could have taken out a handful of cities in the American southeast, south and southeast. Their submarines had nuclear torpedoes that could have done damage to ships. But the bottom line is, if there was a nuclear conflict, the world would not have ended. It would have been a very, very bad time for a lot of Americans and a lot of Russians, a lot of Soviets, but the world wouldn't have ended because we didn't have sufficient quantities of weapons that would have brought about the global ending nuclear winter or radioactive clouds, etc. Today we have thousands, tens of thousands of, not tens of, but thousands of nuclear weapons. And if they're used in a general exchange, it will be global ending. So the consequences of nuclear conflict are far greater today because more damage can be done. But the other thing is, back in during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think there was the absolute prohibition against the use of nuclear weapons, meaning that back then people thought that you could fight and win a nuclear war. We didn't have the mutually assured destruction aspect of it yet. So there were Russian naval commanders who were very close to using nuclear torpedoes against U.S. ships when we were dropping depth charges on them. I don't think Americans understand how close the Russians came to using nuclear weapon. The Russians had a very not lax attitude, but a more liberal approach towards release of nuclear weapons in theater and a tactical nature. So if the U.S. had done an attack on Cuba, Russia would have responded with nuclear weapons, both in terms of hitting U.S. forces that are in the Cuba area and maybe even attacking bases in Florida and elsewhere. So that's a big deal because the U.S. was close to bombing Cuba, and there would have been a nuclear response, and then we would have responded nuclear, and it would have been a bad thing. Today, all major nuclear powers understand that nuclear war can't be won. At least we claim to understand that, and therefore should never be fought. We signed a statement earlier in the year saying exactly that with the 5 named nuclear powers. there's a lot of rhetoric going around, a lot of irresponsible talk. A lot of it is derived from Western perceptions of what Vladimir Putin said when he ordered the initiation of the special military operation, that if NATO intervenes in Ukraine, that Russia will use all the means at its disposal to respond. And everyone went, nukes. Russia's threatening nukes. Maybe, but Russian nuclear doctrine doesn't allow the use of nuclear weapons because NATO intervened in Ukraine. Russian nuclear doctrine only allows the use of nuclear weapons under two conditions. One, if Russia is attacked by nuclear weapons, and two, if conventional military power threatens the very survival of Russia. And that sort of means driving on Moscow, driving on St. Petersburg, decapitation strikes against the leadership. And that doesn't happen when NATO intervenes in Ukraine. So what was Russia talking about? Hypersonics, capabilities that the United States and the West don't have, the Kinzhal missile. I keep mispronouncing that, so any Russian speakers out there, forgive me. But, it's a hypersonic missile. Russia has used it, and it's proven its point that there's nothing in the NATO arsenal that can stop it. But Russia has other hypersonics, some that have been declared, some I believe that haven't been declared. And these missiles these warheads can be used to take out NATO targets throughout the width and breadth of Europe. And this is what Russia meant, that they have the ability to hit the decision-making centers of NATO with non-nuclear capability. They didn't say that, but again, if you study Russian nuclear doctrine, you realize that Putin wasn't threatening the use of nuclear weapons at that point in time. But the West, of course, overreacted, and now the West talks about, well, what do we do if Russia nukes Ukraine? First of all, Russia will never nuke Ukraine. I'll just tell you right off. Russia will never drop a nuclear weapon on Ukraine. Ukraine is considered to be part of, the Russian sphere of influence. Much of Ukraine is considered to be part of Russia. So Russia is not going to nuke Russia. If Russia is going to use nuclear weapons, the last place they'd hit would be Kiev. They would hit London before they hit Kiev. They would hit Paris before they hit Kiev. They would hit Berlin before they hit Kiev. They're not going to bomb Ukraine. So anybody knowledgeable about this would never allow this conversation to continue, but the West is full of ignorant people who are trying to score propaganda points. So right off the bat, they say that Russia is irresponsible, threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Then the West has to get into a discussion. Well, what do we do if Russia nukes Ukraine? And then it is, well, we're not going to use nuclear weapons against Russia, but we will use conventional weapons in a devastating manner to destroy the Russian military, to destroy potentially even Putin himself. One of the options discussed, according to Newsweek, was a decapitation strike on the Kremlin, which is stupid because that triggers the dead hand, which releases Russian nuclear arms. But my point is, there's a lot of talk, and it makes it sound like the situation today is very dangerous. And indeed, it is dangerous because we have two nuclear powers where they're talking about the potential of nuclear conflict. But when you parse it down, the reality is neither Russia nor the United States want a nuclear conflict. And they are working to deconflict that aspect of it. So while the words sound big, and you never can rest easy when nuclear weapons are involved, I think we're at greater risk in the Cuban Missile Crisis of actually using nuclear weapons. Consequences of that use were not as grave as they are today. Today, any accident means the end of the world. Therefore, we must pay a whole bunch of attention. It doesn't do anybody good to go, hey, Ritter said it ain't as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to go to bed tonight and not worry about it. No, go to bed tonight and be very worried about it, because all it takes is one mistake, one miscalculation, one act of stupidity, and the world ends. Literally ends.
Yeah, that's the thing, because why do you think it is that so many countries, especially Western countries, are really just encouraging this conflict to continue? And we've seen these escalations: Crimea Bridge, Nord Stream, sanctions coming in December 5th, another round. Because like you said, it just takes one mistake or one human error. Which aside from the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were multiple occasions in the Cold War where, people who analysts in front of their radar screens thought they were looking at an incoming nuclear strike, and thank God they didn't fire nukes in response because there wasn't one. So, there's also technical errors that can happen. Despite all this danger, why do we see so much rhetoric that's just, encouraging the war? I don't understand. What do you make of it?
I think you respect that which you fear. And back in the 1980s, we feared nuclear weapons because we understood nuclear weapons. We understood what the consequences were because they were a part of our everyday life. I was in a nuclear capable field artillery unit that trained several times a year on firing nuclear shells in combat conditions. I was a weapons inspector in a treaty that was getting rid of operational nuclear weapons deployed on European soil, ready to fire against the enemy. This was a real threat, and we understood the real consequences. I think Europe's gotten soft in the head, and so has America, about the threat of nuclear weapons. For a long time, the United States just assumed after the collapse of the Soviet Union that we were the sole remaining superpower and that we had nuclear supremacy over everybody. And we really didn't have to worry. We stopped focusing on arms control, meaningful arms control. And we just started focusing on how we can maximize our strength based upon our potential. And at some point in time, the United States stopped talking about meaningful disarmament and started saying, how can we turn this investment that we've made into nuclear weapons? How can we capitalize upon it? How can we make it work for us? How do we make this investment work? Whereas in the 1980s, we never wanted that investment to work. It was like, we're investing in this because it's deterrence, pure, simple deterrence. But we don't want it to work. We're not trying to maximize our investment. We're actually trying to minimize it by getting rid of it. But we stopped doing that. We stopped getting rid of weapons. And now you have people saying, well, if we're going to pour this many $1 billion into this every year, how do we maximize this? And they started, it's like, we're literally, we don't study history. You'd think that the nuclear planners would look back and say, this ain't the first rodeo. We've done this before. Go back and study, the development of nuclear strategy in the 1950s and 1960s. You had people who were the war gamers in Rand, and they'd run these war games. You had literal Dr. Strangeloves talking about how we can win a nuclear war. We will take out their industrial base. We'll do this. Yes, we're going to lose 100 million dead, but we'll be able to survive this. It's a winnable war. Winnable war, losing 100 million. I don't think so. We know, for a while we stopped talking about winnable wars because we embraced mutually assured destruction. But today, we're once back again in the business where these idiot war gamers are saying, we can win a nuclear war. We can control the escalation. We can, use a low yield nuclear warhead to send a message, to send a signal. And it's if they don't read the Russian nuclear doctrine that says any nuclear attack against us releases everything, that we don't believe in a limited war. We don't believe in a contained nuclear conflict. We believe in nuclear conflict. And if you attack us, we will respond by destroying everything. These war gamers are like, nah, they're just bluffing. We can conceive of a scenario where we can use a nuclear weapon to get away with this, that, and the other thing. Biden ran on the promise that he was going to pursue what's called the single-purpose nuclear posture. Single purpose is the only purpose of America's nuclear arsenal is deterrence. That it only exists to deter another nation from using nuclear weapons against us. If you use nuclear weapons against us, we will respond, but we won't use nuclear weapons under any other circumstance. And normally you'd say, that's okay. I like that. But no, our war gamers, the Rand thinkers, all these idiots up there that get paid lots of money to pretend that they're Dr. Strangelove, have all come down and said, no. See, if we do that, we limit the potential. What we need to do is hold the world hostage to the threat of American nuclear weapons use. So we will articulate a policy that we can conceive of using nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear environment. We could conceive of a situation where in case of a cyber attack, we might respond with nuclear weapons. And what this does, and it's so nebulous that it leaves the world going, we don't understand. When would America use nuclear weapons? And the answer is, you don't know. So America is literally the madman. This is an adaptation of Richard Nixon's madman theory, where he tried to say to the North Vietnamese, hey, I may just up and use nuclear weapons on you because I'm that crazy. And if you don't want me to use nuclear weapons, why don't you come to the negotiating table? Maybe we'll bring an end to this conflict. I don't know. I might wake up tomorrow and say, "What the hell? Let's nuke North Vietnam. I'm crazy." And that was his theory. He articulated to his chief of staff and to others. He wasn't going to use, but he wanted people to think that he could do that. And that's sort of what's going on today with the Biden nuclear posture. It's basically telling the world, yeah, we don't even know when we're going to use nuclear weapons. We could wake up tomorrow and decide we need to preempt here or there. We don't know. We're crazy. You don't know. So don't mess with us. Don't test us. Don't you dare stand up to us. Don't you attack us. Don't you do anything, because who knows what we're going to do. We're just that crazy. That's stupid nuclear policy. That's ignorance. We've done this before. People smarter than the people that are in there today thought about this, considered it, and ultimately this was rejected as literally suicidal policy. Biden claimed to be smarter than this, but again, I don't get along with Biden, so I'm guilty of having prejudice against him. So I'll leave it at that. But the point is, why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? I mean, especially when we think that we learned that a square wheel doesn't roll very well, that it needs to be round. But somehow we're back to thinking that a square wheel is going to roll. It isn't, guys. A square wheel doesn't work. It has to be a round wheel. And a round wheel is disarmament, getting rid of nuclear weapons. A square wheel is trying to make nuclear weapons fit into some sort of grand strategy. No.
So, the resemblance is uncanny. It's funny because just a few days ago I was watching Peter Sellers and George Scott in Doctor Strangelove. It's amazing. It's so relevant even today. And
no fighting in the war room. No fighting in the war room.
Gentlemen, please.
Don't let them see the big map. Great movie. I love it. We showed it to the Soviets when we first went over there. We had a movie night, and it was one of the first times that the Soviet escorts were allowed, the factory workers, and they work at a missile factory, were allowed into our quarters. And we had the big screen TV, and we put in the videotape, and we played Doctor Strange. And the American, we're just howling because we all know the lines. We're all doing it, fluids. And all the Soviets are going, "Why are you guys laughing? This is about nuclear war." "Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?" "No, it's not funny. We don't find anything funny about this." They didn't get the movie, and I don't blame them. But
yeah, I can understand why. But speaking of disarmament, I just wanted to plug your book again, which is magnificent. It's Scott's new book. It's called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, and it's basically about implementation of the INF Treaty. So extremely pertinent and relevant to everything that we're discussing. And I see we've got about 3,000 people watching. So guys, please remember to hit the like button, because it helps YouTube promote the video, and it's good for the channel. Scott, I was going to ask you about OPEC Plus, because since the last time we spoke, OPEC Plus, which includes not just the Saudis but the Russians, they basically decided to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. And I laugh because the Russians actually wanted to cut it by 1 million. It's the Saudis who said, no, let's double it. We'll do minus 2 million. Yeah. So what did you make of that? And this statement that the Saudis put out, kind of telling Biden, like, we don't care if you have midterms. We're not going to pursue oil policy because it's good for your elections.
Well, Saudi Arabia has a project. I think it's called Project 2030 or Saudi Arabia 2030, but it's long-term vision of where it wants to be in 2030. And part of that is to gravitate from an economy that's totally based on oil to an economy that's more diverse. But in order to do that, there needs to be significant investments. And Saudi Arabia has a history of supporting U.S. policy objectives when it comes to setting global energy production. And they've sacrificed their economy on numerous occasions for the sole benefit of the United States, to help the United States. And it got to the point where, Saudi Arabia was not going to be able to implement their Vision 2030 plan. And I think this reality came home at the same time that, I'm not defending this at all, but at the same time that Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, brutally murdered. and the United States rightfully called him out on it.
Mhm.
It appears that he ordered it. Um, and how do you deal with that? You deal with that by calling him out. Now, but the problem is if you're going to call somebody out, and Biden called him out, and Biden also said during the campaign that he will never deal with this pariah.
Yeah.
That he's going to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah nation. He's not going to meet with this guy. He's not going to legit. Okay, nice statements. We're on your side, Joe. Go.
Fist bump.
Wait a minute, Joe. You got an economic problem here. Gas prices are too high, and we need the Saudis to increase oil production because we've committed suicide by sanctioning Russian energy. But how do you increase oil production if you don't go to the Saudis and ask? So he had to crawl on his knees. Now, he claims he went there to talk about Iran. Anybody who believes that, man, show me what you're smoking, because I've never smoked dope, but I might pick it up because it's got to be good. He didn't go there to talk about Iran. He went there to talk about oil. That's the most important thing. And, he fist bumped the dude. And then he, had a very cold discussion where he laid out the case of why America needed, and he basically expected Saudi Arabia to behave as Saudi Arabia had always behaved in the past, a compliant little poodle. But this time, MBS said something else. He said, "I hear you. I know you want this 1 million barrel increase, but I don't get to make that decision by myself. It's July. In August, I'm meeting with OPEC Plus, and we'll make that decision there." OPEC Plus means Russia. It means that Saudi Arabia is saying, we're going to talk to the Russians about whether or not we're going to help your economy.
Stings.
And that should have sent a chill through Biden's spine. Now, the Russians, they didn't want to go for blood. They just, the Russians are sitting there saying, hey, you're restricting our access to the oil market. So we need to survive by having oil prices go up to compensate for the lack of volume. It's basic business 101. Even a Marine understands this. And so the Russians were like, nah, we're not going to let you go up. We need to cut the price by 1 million. And the Saudis said, I'll do you one better, buddy. 2 million, because we don't like this guy. This guy we don't like. We're not here for him. And this is the most important part. We don't fear him. We're not concerned about him. We're pivoting to the east. We now believe that our strategic interests lie with the viable markets and with people who don't threaten us. Because all the United States does is threaten. And the Saudis are fed up with it. So is the rest of the world. This is why Saudi Arabia is doing the unheard of. For a oil producing nation that is the sort of the centerpiece of the petrodollar.
Right.
Saudi Arabia is starting to sell oil for currencies that aren't the dollar in significant quantity. I think Saudi Arabia is just fed up with the United States, fed up with America, fed up with Joe Biden, fed up with the nonsense. And that's what's happening here. It's a thumb in the eye of America. And there's not anything America can do about it. Really, nothing. Think about it. We need Saudi Arabia. We've committed across the board. Israel. One of the key aspects of our relationship with Israel now is the Abrams Accord, bringing Israel into the Gulf Arab states. Now, we don't want to just give them the cheap seats. We want them sitting at the big table. The big table is run by Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. The entree there were these islands in the Red Sea that Egypt had been occupying, but now the Egypts are going to give back to the Saudis, but the Saudis have to make certain conditions about stationing of troops and things of that nature. But this looks like it was going to work. The Saudis weren't directly negotiating with the Israelis, but they were negotiating with the Egyptians as a middleman, and which means that there's active discussions between the two. Airplanes could fly in. I mean, stuff was happening. So is the United States going to throw that away? That's Iran.
That's a very good point.
We were positioning Saudi Arabia, to confront Iran. Are we now going to throw that away? So the United States is between a rock and a hard place. And I don't mean Iraq and a hard place. I mean a rock and a hard place. And they're also between Iraq and a hard place. But the point is, they're trapped by, the complexity of their policies where everything's interlinked, and they're trapped by the ridiculousness of their political leader, our political leader, Joe Biden. You anybody knows you can't sit there and insult the leader of a sovereign nation whose support you need desperately, and expect to get that support. And so, Joe Biden's in a bind right now. I mean, he's depleting the strategic petroleum reserves.
Yeah.
He's, I mean, he's going to lose the election, and one of the reasons why his party's going to lose the election. One of the reasons is because of high energy prices and the inflationary, trends that are attached to that.
You heard any chatter about Venezuela or Iran? Because the Iran deal, from my viewpoint, where it's happening, it looks there's just silence right now. Nothing's moving forward.
No, well, the important thing here is that one of the things to make the Iran deal viable to the Iranians was the potential of an economic gain, an economic benefit. But we held on to this card too long. We being the United States. Iran has adapted, and they are building their economy based upon the reality that's been dealt to them, not the artificial potential of a post-sanction engagement with Europe. First of all, why would Iran want to engage with Europe right now? What does Europe have to offer? Depression, recession, the collapsed industry. So Iran is looking and saying, well, hey, where's the economic players here? We want to play poker, but we don't want to play at the penny table. We want to go play at the $100 chip table, and that table is run by the Chinese and the Russians. So that's the direction Iran's going. Iran is committed strategically to helping Russia in the Ukraine conflict with the provision of drone technology, maybe even ballistic missile technology. I don't think Iran is losing any sleep over the failure of the United States to rejoin the JCPOA. I think Iran, Russia, China have adjusted to the reality of a post-JCPOA world, and I would be surprised if this thing's ever given consideration again. I think the program, I think it's dead in the water. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, that's.
I don't know. I mean, Venezuela is a tough one. Put yourself in Maduro's shoes. You now have the opportunity to sell oil and revive your economy, but in doing so, you turn your back on the people that kept you alive for this much time, your friends, your allies, etc. But I also think, and again, this is where Russia's literally the adult in the room. I think Russia's posture is, hey, Venezuela, you got to do what you got to do to survive, and we'll support that. So don't commit suicide on our behalf. We're here to help you regardless of what decision you make. And it depends how many concessions. I think Venezuela is dragging their feet because they want more concessions from the United States, and they're going to wait for that ultimate moment of vulnerability and make a move. But I do think Venezuela will end up selling oil to the United States just because it makes sense to them economically. And I mean, the plight of the Venezuelan people is dire. And Maduro, at the end of the day, I believe he truly cares about the Venezuelan people. And so he cares about sovereignty. He cares about not being seen as being a stooge of America or a tool of America. But the oil needs to be sold. American refineries are geared towards Venezuelan crude. And it's a match made in petroleum heaven.
You mentioned the drones, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, because the Iranians have been giving the Russians these Shahid and Mohajer drones, and my understanding was that the Russians were building their own variant. These are basically, I know they call them kamikaze drones, but they're basically like V1s from Nazi Germany, World War II. They
except they hit their target.
Except they hit the target, right? They're actually precise. What do you make of this transfer of weapons from Iran to the Russians? And because the Iranians officially they're neither denying nor confirming it. They're just kind of silent about it.
Well, I mean, they don't need to confirm it to anybody. I mean, it's between them and Russia. Russia doesn't need to confirm it. Iran doesn't need to leave the world guessing. That's fine. Look. When the story first came out, I have to admit that I thought it was Western propaganda. I mean, I thought that Russia may, I mean, I believe the intelligence reports that say that Russia sent a delegation there in, I believe, in June or July, and that they were looking at a variety of drone options. You know, and I thought that maybe Russia signaled that they were entering into an arrangement with their defense industry where they were going to gear up a factory in Russia that was going to produce maybe variants of the Iranian drone. But I'm someone who said, look, the Russians have their own drone technology, their own drone production capacity. That those drones are geared towards Russian doctrine. They use Russian electronics. They're compatible with Russian communications. So it doesn't make any sense for Russia to go off and get the Iranian drones. It shows you how much I know because I was wrong on this. I was sort of wrong. I talked with a Russian expert, and he said, no, our drones were geared for a specific doctrine. You were right on that. That we have a very operational doctrine, very mobile doctrine, and the drones we had were designed to support that doctrine. We weren't geared for this static warfare that we're in right now with trench warfare, et cetera. Our weapons are very expensive. And right now we have a lot of targets that need to be hit that aren't traditional high value targets. And so it's expensive for us to use these drones against these targets.
Yeah.
And we don't have enough drones. We didn't plan it this way. And so it makes sense for Russia now to go and get a ready-made drone can be plugged in and used in a non-doctrinal fashion, meaning that it's a standalone weapon. You don't have to integrate it into everything else that Russia is doing. And that's what the Shahed 136 or the Geranium 2 is. It's that. But, the way things like this normally work is that you provide some examples, completed examples that are used for reverse engineering for training. And then once the Russians achieve a certain level of proficiency, you provide kits, and the kits are shipped, and then the Russians will assemble the kits because that's what the Russians want. They want to get used to assembling this themselves. While they are assembling kits, they're learning how to produce the component parts. So at some point in time, you transition away from kit assembly to producing a purely indigenous model of the Iranian drone. So I think that's where we're at right now, because there's some evidence when they look at these drones, they see some parts that have some Farsi written on them and stuff like that. So it's clear that there's a kit here, but you also see evidence that these are manufactured, parts are manufactured in Russia. Now, Russia, again, the Iranians built these drones to meet an Iranian operational requirement. The Russians have a different operational requirement. They're operating in a different operational environment. And so the Russians are watching how the Ukrainians are responding to this, and they're seeing that the Ukrainians are becoming more effective in shooting down the Shahed 136. So what the Russians are doing is adapting this, modifying it to have different capabilities so that they have greater flexibility on how they employ this weapon and increase its survivability. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing generational development of the Shahed 136 or the Geranium 2. And this is purely a Russian adaptation, So I think that's happening. The Russians are, again, they're facing a kind of war that I don't think they anticipated. I think the Russians thought that this conflict was going to be over sooner, and that they're adapting to this, and that adaptation also has to take into the reality of ammunition expenditure, specifically specific kinds of ammunition, precision guided munitions, missiles, et cetera, which the Russians are using at a rate probably far greater than had been planned. And so if they continue down this path, they're going to be depleting their stocks of precision guided munitions, which they need for potential scenarios that are outside of Ukraine. There's contingencies that could happen in the Kuril Islands. There's the Kaliningrad. There's Poland. There's Moldova. There's Transnistria. There's a whole bunch of contingencies where they might need these weapons beyond simply the battle in Ukraine. So it makes sense for Russia to go out and acquire weapons capabilities that are simply standalone plug-in, meaning you don't have to fully integrate it into the Russian way of war. Given the unique circumstances of the positional war that they're fighting, you just plug them in and fire them away and use them as a standalone capability. And, the Iranians have some very good weapons. So it wouldn't surprise me if Russia was buying even more than the Shahed 136 or the other drone system that you mentioned. Wouldn't surprise me at all now. Now, of course, I've made this statement and find out that I'm wrong on that too, that Russia's not doing this. That's okay. The thing about doing analysis, long distance analysis, is it's an imperfect science. It's art, really. And you go on the data you get. I don't have a phone that I can pick up and call the Russian ministry that says, hey, what's really going on with this? Really buying Iranian missiles? And the last time I tried to call the president of Iran, he wouldn't pick up my phone. So, the point is, I'm just running with conjecture. Maybe it's informed speculation, but it's speculation nonetheless. What's interesting is, this war, the way it's developing, we'll have an answer in a week or so. I mean, we'll know one way or the other.
I have a couple of sources who confirm to me that they're giving them the drones in so many words, right? So that coupled with the video evidence, the photo evidence, the picture is quite clear, I'd say. And
yeah.
I thought of how the Glock, for example, they have an Austrian version, and then they have one that's built inside of the US. So, that came to mind when I heard there's a Russian variant. It's probably like what you just mentioned with the kit, and then the transitioning to producing that locally. It's normal. It happens all the time when they license weapons from one country to another. So that would make sense, I suppose.
But it is rare for Iran to be doing this with Russia. I mean, this is a major development. It's a big development. It goes back to the discussion we had about Iran pivoting to the east.
Yeah.
Iran has always been reticent about having close military relations with Russia. It wasn't that long ago when I know that when I was in the Marine Corps, one of the contingencies that we trained for was to do forcible seizure of Chabahar and Bandar Abbas so that we could come ashore to stop the Russians from driving down out of Afghanistan to seize these warm water ports. So we were getting ready to fight an inland battle in Iran against a Russian invader. So that's in my lifetime. I know I'm old, but it wasn't that long ago. And so suddenly to have the Iranians and the Russians cooperating on this level of intimacy is it's truly it's just an astounding thing.
Yeah, I saw a report that they've spotted an Iranian drone over Belarus, and so that's also very interesting. And I enjoy the paradox that they were making fun of Russia for buying the drones. They were saying, "Oh, Russia's broke. Russia's drones are terrible." They're going to Iran to get those Iranian drones, which suck. And then the script is suddenly flipped, and now suddenly these drones they're devastating because they're so precise and damaging. I mean, which one is it?
Not just that, but these missiles that are being used to shoot these drones down, I can't give you a precise figure, but let's just roughly guess and say, $1.5 million, or maybe let's say $750,000. Whatever, it's a lot of money. A drone ain't a lot of money. It's $20,000. $20,000 moped comes flitting into Ukraine, blows up a target. Now they have to fire three, $750,000 missiles at it. Marine math tells me that that's an exchange Russia will do all day long. They'll throw 30 grand on the table and watch you put, 3 million on the table, 2.5 million on the table every time. And we'll just do it again. 30 grand, 3 million, 30 grand, 3 million. You're broke. I'm not broke. So, this is, and it's not just that they're expending these missiles, they're destroying things. These drones are very accurate. They're very effective. The interesting thing wasn't watching the Ukrainians panic. The interesting thing was watching Europe panic, because Europe had an emergency meeting to discuss the vulnerability of the European power grid to drone attack, and realizing that, oh my God, if we ever did expand this conflict against Russia, they have a capability now that we can't stop. We don't have anything to stop this. So the Europeans now are like, not talking about how we put air defense on Ukraine, it's how do we put air defense on Europe? Where's our integrated air defense? Because we ain't got nothing that can stop these guys.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, do you think these protests, these riots that are happening in Iran, is there a correlation there between the timing of the drones, Iranian drones being used in Russia? Because, I would say that it's a bit sketchy, and you and I both know there's always ample support from the US and the UK to any sort of dissent in Iran. So Do you think there's any correlation between the two?
Well, the trigger was the death of this Iranian girl, and
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about the video evidence that seems to be contrary to the narrative that's being portrayed in the West. It doesn't matter. Perception is perception, and it appears that there might be some legitimate grievance, whether it's based on reality or based upon disinformation, doesn't matter. I think that there's legitimate grievance in Iran that has bubbled up. And so the reason why I bring that up is that seems to be the trigger for what's going on. I think the CIA, MI6, the Dutch, and others have long had cells operating in Iran that do what we call digital democracy. The idea is to use social media platforms and modern technology, a way of communicating to create this underground of dissent, etc. The dissent can, be manifested in terms of protests, but there's some that can be manifested in terms of violence. For instance, the links between Western intelligence and these Baluch terrorist or liberation organizations, between the Iranian Arab community with the Mujahideen al-Khalq and with the monarchists. That seems to be one that's been getting a lot of attention lately from the U.S. We have CIA teams in Los Angeles that's working very closely with Iranian immigrant populations to that support the monarchy, return to the monarchy, and they have links inside Iran. So all of these pieces are there. And what I think it happened is that there was legitimate grievance over the death of this girl. Iranian women who rightfully, from my perspective, again, I respect Iran's right to have the laws that it has, but they don't want the hijab. They protest the hijab, and they feel that this girl died because of ridiculous morality laws. So they're starting to protest, and that protest took off. And at that point in time, the CIA and MI6 is going, whoa, whoa, whoa. The opportunity we're looking for is here. Execute Plan B. They start calling in the shots, and now they have people coming up. They have the violence ticking in. They're doing so. I think the expansion of the demonstrations into this new wave of violence is purely foreign driven. Purely foreign driven. I don't believe that the women cutting off their hair were inclined to go out and stone Iranian policemen to death.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that was their intent, but that's what's happening right now. It's becoming a violent uprising. It's very similar to what happened in Dara in 2011 in Syria.
Yeah, that came to mind as well. It was basically legitimate grievances being taken advantage of and then turned into something else by 15 parties. Yeah, that's what it looked like to me. It looks like to me.
I think pulling the trigger, the West does have the option not to pull the trigger. What I mean is, okay, so women are cutting their hair and making videos and all that stuff. We could have the option and say, now's not the time. But we decided that now is the time, largely because of what's going on with Iran helping Russia. Now's the time to pull the trigger. I don't think we created this mess. I think we're taking advantage of an opportunity that was, timely, and so we're pulling the trigger and doing all the digital democracy and actual violence. I mean, this is a dangerous situation for Iran. I mean, I don't think it's of the kind that I don't think the theocracy's at risk of being overthrown, but Iran was looking at a period of relative stability. They were focusing on growing their economy. And now I think Iran is probably going to go through ask the Mujahideen al-Khalq the last time the theocracy decided to stamp them out, what it cost. And I'm not encouraging that, but I'm just saying that this theocracy is fully capable of going medieval on people. And that may be the direction we're heading in the short term. And that's never a good thing for anybody involved. So
I saw
again, we destabilize the nation to the point where thousands of innocent people are going to die for no positive outcome for the West, because you're not going to overthrow the regime. We don't do regime change very well. This isn't Mossadegh 1953. This is a well-established theocracy that has tremendous amount of support amongst the mainstream Iranian population. We have a tendency in the West to buy into northern Tehran. and think that that's all of Iran. Northern Tehran, where all the well-to-do people live and all that stuff, maintain close ties with the West, have the fancy shopping malls, the women to wear the fancy dresses with the hijabs pulled back. Hey, God bless them. I mean, live your life. And I actually personally believe that I'm more inclined to live your life, but I'm not Muslim. I'm not a Shia. I'm not Iranian. I'm an American. All right. So the fact that I identify with your life doesn't mean that your version of life comports with what the leaders of Iran and the majority of the Iranian people appear to want. So, we're trending towards violence. People are going to die. Economies are going to be destabilized at a time when the world can't afford additional instability. This is just stupidity writ large. But that pretty much is what the CIA stands for: stupidity writ large.
You mentioned the MEK, and I remember the woman who heads it, I think her name is Rojavi. She was meeting with the Israeli ambassador to Albania just last month. When these events in Iran started, and the thing with the hijab is I understand both, because Syria is secular. So in Syria you do whatever you want. You want to wear it, you don't want to wear it, it's up to you. And Syria has everything. Christians, Muslims, you name it. So and so does Iran. They also have their own minorities, and everyone's treated well and everything. But at the same time, I know from Syria, you don't overstep the boundaries and start saying what people in the other religion or your neighbor should wear or not wear. So I understand both of them. I get it. And I think it's most important always to focus on the political aspect of it, because this is more of a religious and social and cultural thing. And when it comes to Western countries or neighboring countries taking advantage of unrest to foment regime change, that's something different than people having legitimate grievances. Because
I think I believe that the Iranian leadership is mature and responsible. I don't necessarily agree with everything. I don't agree with everything my government does, but yeah, so what? I think that they sincerely care about the people of Iran, and I take them at face value when they say, hey, maybe we need to examine this issue about the morality police and how they interact with women more closely. The thing about Shia Islam, the way the Iranians practice it, is that the grand ayatollahs, when they form their marjas or their gatherings, they write something, I think it's called a risala. I'm horrible with words, but it's basically their interpretation of how Islam impacts life. And they answer questions and they publish this thing. And then they go out, and if enough people read this and say, hey, we support this guy, they will gravitate to him and he'll get a following. Now, of course, the supreme leader is the supreme leader, but he's also has to, in order to be the supreme leader, he has to, the trust that the Iranian people have with him has to be earned. It's not necessarily given. And so if the Iranian people are starting to not identify with the way the country's being run, a balance has to be struck. And I hear the president say, we need to sit down and talk with these people. We need to figure this out. Now, if you're somebody who cares about women's rights in Iran, that's what you want. You want that to happen. But the best way to guarantee that it doesn't happen is to weaponize that.
Yeah.
Turn the process of dialogue into something that threatens the Iranian regime. You're actually putting women's rights in reverse. You're making it harder for this, because from now on, the Iranians are going to equate women's rights movements with CIA-backed coup attempts. And this is just the absolute wrong approach if you really care about women's rights. But here's my pro tip to anybody listening to this. America doesn't care about women's rights. We don't care about any rights. We only care about American strength. And therefore, we will use anything to our advantage, regardless of the consequences. We're hurting the Iranian women right now. We're hurting the cause of Iranian women by doing what we're doing.
Yeah, and just one thing I wanted to add is I remember most degree holders and university graduates in Iran are women, actually. So I mean that's pretty amazing, and illiteracy is There is none. So
they're smart, they drive, they work. I mean, look, there's a glass ceiling. Let's not pretend otherwise. There's a glass ceiling. Iranian women are not the equal of Iranian men in terms of opportunities, but they're not Saudi women.
that was what I wanted to say. The Saudis have a morality police. The women in Saudi Arabia are treated vastly inferiorly if you want to compare to Iran or anywhere. So, I don't see anyone on Western media complaining about the Saudis, weirdly enough. They don't care about those women.
We need their oil. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Scott, can I ask you about the referendum that took place in Ukraine, your referendums, because that's also another major event that happened since the last time we spoke. As usual, just like any election or referendum or any democratic process that takes place in the evil countries, so Iran, Syria, Venezuela, the West came out preemptively and said this is a sham and it's illegitimate and so on. And the thing is that I understand this is another beast because, this is a question of international law. Where do you see the referendum and the Russian annexation in terms of international law? And
well, let's start off with the principle of self-determination. That's one of the fundamental principles of the United Nations. But to exercise self-determination, a referendum has to be fair. It has to be available to everybody, and there can be no pressures put on people to vote. So right off the bat, Russia has a problem because the areas in which these referendums are being held are in conflict. And I got a dog that's just going absolutely crazy. I mean, there's not much I can do about it because somebody's at the door. But the half the population, not half, but a large part of the population has fled. I mean, many of the Ukrainian residents of these territories aren't there. They fled to other locations, either deeper into Ukraine or into Europe, and they weren't able to participate. So on the surface, one can make the claim that these referendums did not meet international standards and therefore weren't legitimate. But then there's always the other side of the coin. The Russians, for 8 years, watched while the Russian population of Donbass was shelled and subjected to horrific deprivations at the hand of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have positioned themselves to embrace a version of virulent ultranationalism that views the Russians as subhumans. They're orcs. And in this light, Russia cannot tolerate any continuation of a system that allows this kind of abuse to be targeted on the Russian people. And so Russia held referendum that took into account the will of the Russian people. And I think that will was well represented. I think that the Russian people want the outcome. And frankly speaking, the Ukrainian people lost the right to participate. I'm sorry, Ukraine, but when you endorsed the ideology of Stepan Bandera, you cease to be relevant in a modern discussion. When you support white supremacy to the point that you view Russians as subhumans, you don't get to participate in this anymore. And that's where the Ukrainian government is, and that's where the Ukrainian people are. And I know that's a broad brush. People are going, you can't paint all Ukrainians the same. Yes, I can, and I just did. Because you know what, Ukraine, for 8 years, you were silent. If you're one of these Ukrainians to say, that's not me, then where were you while 8 years you shelled Donbass? Where were you? Where were you when the Russians voted, or when the Ukrainian parliament elevated Stepan Bandera to national hero status? Where were you while the Azov Battalion and the Adar Battalion, the Krakens and the Safaris and all these other ultranationalist neo-Nazi units? And there's no neo-Nazi issue in Iran. I mean, in Ukraine, what are you talking about? I don't know. Why don't we refer to the United States Congress and the amendments that were put on defense appropriations from 2015 onwards, which said no taxpayer money could go to the Azov Battalion because it's a white supremacist neo-Nazi unit, and it's not the only one. They identified others as well. We know there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. We did nothing about it. And the Ukrainians also did nothing about it. They allowed it to have people saying, well, it's a minority. They're a political minority. No, there might be a political minority, but they're a violent majority. They used violence to shoehorn themselves into positions of power. And you, the people of Ukraine, did nothing. So you lost the right to participate in a referendum. Tough luck. That's what happens when you lose wars. Tough luck. Now, international law, maybe they have a case. But reality, those territories are now constitutionally part of Russia. And there ain't nothing going to happen in the world that's going to change that. Nothing.
The Stefan Bandera stuff is insane. I mean, this guy is a Nazi collaborator. He killed Jews. What makes him a hero of Ukraine or any place? I mean, how is this guy a national hero? In whose book?
Because he basically created the notion of modern day Ukrainian nationalism. He's the one that said the Ukrainians aren't, part of Galicia. They're not, part of Russia. They are a separate ethnic identity. And like most supremacist groups, they become, it's literally white supremacy. This is why when the Germans, the Aryan race, the master race, marched into Western Ukraine, they were treated literally with flowers and songs, parades. 80,000 Ukrainian men signed up almost immediately to join the German forces. Over 200,000 eventually signed up, fought in SS divisions. Many others were used in these death squads. The 40,000 Jews that were killed at Babi Yar, the deaths might have been ordered by the Germans. The triggers were pulled by Banderists, Ukrainians.
Yeah.
During the period of time, when they were fighting, Soviet authority, they slaughtered over 100,000 Polish citizens. They called them subhumans. They slaughtered nearly 200,000 Russians. They called them subhumans. And yet we're supporting these people. And this is why I have no tolerance. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure in the academic world, they're all going tisk, tisk, tisk. I don't care. But from a moral standpoint, you literally can't support and legitimize anything that's related to Stepan Bandera. And right now, Ukraine is nothing but a nation that's defined by Stepan Bandera. Their white supremacist attitude is derived from Bandera's ideology. They fly his colors. They support. Good Lord, Congress allowed 4 of these idiots into the people's house. We brought 4 Azov members to Congress in September. We welcomed them into Congress. We feted them. We wined. We dined them.
Scandalous.
They held an auction on congressional property where they auctioned off Nazi memorabilia, Azov patches with Nazi symbols. They raised $30,000, and they're just treated like it. Then they were sent there. I think they're in Stanford right now, where our good old friend Michael McFaul is bringing them in, treating them like heroes. They're Nazis, Michael. They're Nazis. This is the wife of the leader of Azov, who currently is in sort of a parole-based isolation in Turkey. He was released by Russia, but he has to stay in Turkey for the duration of the conflict. She's accompanying them. He's a murdering, rapist thug, and we're letting the wife come around and talk about him as if he's a hero. There's another guy who's still in Russian custody. His wife is there. Jamie Raskin, the congressman from Maryland, who likes to get up and say, Vladimir Putin's a LGBTQ, trans, homosexual, hating person, and he's the worst person in the world. So I want to introduce you to the Azov people, who are actually the most LGBTQ hating people. And the wife of this one guy leads an organization in Ukraine, I think it's called the White Roses or something like that, that is all about being anti-lesbian, anti-gay, anti-LB. And she's here being embraced by, there's the hypocrisy of the U.S. Congress knows no bounds.
It's incredible. It's nuts. It's nuts. Just, it's contradiction after contradiction, and it's insulting. I think it's very insulting, to everybody's intelligence and history.
Now, not to be insulting, but if I have to leave very soon to pick up my wife, or else my marriage will be.
Scott, my last question. My last question. Netanyahu, he's set to return to office. Do you think he's going to start sending weapons to the Ukrainians? Do you think there'll be any change in that policy, that this fine line Israel's been walking between the two?
No, because the people that are in power now are equally hardline about this issue. Look, Israel has a very complicated relationship with Russia and Ukraine that's derived from the Aliyah, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Russian and Ukrainian Jews that left the former Soviet Union and came to settle in Israel. And the social and economic ties that link these communities are real. The relationship between Russia and Israel is very complex, but very close. I mean, think about it. There's a reason why Jonathan Pollard is hated in the United States. And it isn't that he spied for Israel. It's that he gave Israeli the golden crown jewels, and Israel gave it to Russia. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So there's very close relations. Israel has to balance the threat of Russia in Syria. When the Russians want, they can close Syrian airspace to Israel.
Yep.
So what's it worth to them? I think what's going to happen is that the Israelis are going to find third-party conduits where they're going to be providing weapons to third parties, and then those weapons will make their way to Ukraine. Russia will know about this, but Russia will, turn a blind eye to it because Russia also understands that there is a need to maintain an important, stable balance with Israel. It's in Russia's interest not to allow this relationship to totally break. And all that's going to happen is the Israeli equipment will go to Ukraine, and then the Ukrainians that use it will die, and that equipment will be destroyed. That's the ultimate outcome of every piece of equipment that's going to be sent to Ukraine. None of it will survive. All of it will be destroyed, and the Ukrainians that attach themselves to that equipment will either be killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. So Israel, send away. It's just a waste of money, a waste of lives. But then again, that's the entire Western approach to Ukraine. We don't care about their lives, and we don't care about our money, as long as at the end of the day, they kill more Russians.
Scott, thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful. And again, everybody, if you want to follow Scott, he's on Telegram. It's t.me/Scott Ritter, and get his new book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. You'll find it everywhere in Amazon, Barnes & Noble, everywhere. It's available worldwide. So Scott, again, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and I can't wait to have you back on the show again. We've got about 4,000 people watching, so please, guys, make sure you've pressed the like button, and please share the video so word gets out and people everywhere can enjoy Scott's magnificent analysis and insight. Thank you again, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Can I just add one last thing?
Sure.
I've been told to say this. I don't like self-promotion, but we'll do it. ScottRitterExtra.com. Apparently, all the videos that I do, this is where they're officially allowed to be brought together. So it's a one-stop shop for anything I write, anything that I participate in. And if people are inclined to donate or help out, that's it. But the reason why I bring that up is some people are giving money to websites that pretend to be me, but aren't me. And
yeah,
I'm not asking for money, but anybody who's doing that, I don't think that's fair to them. It's not right on the part of the people that are using this. So the only place, and the reason I'm bringing up is the only official website that's attached to my name is ScottRitterExtra.com.
Here it is. It's on the screen. I'll put the link in the chat. ScottRitterExtra.com. Thanks for pointing that out. That is quite important. And I always ask people where where the viewers can find their work. So that answers the question. Is there any other site or link?
That's it. I'm slowly expanding, but I'm a simple guy. One link, one stop, one shop.
Okay,
so
that's great.
And none of it's hidden behind a paywall. None of it's hidden behind a paywall. Accessible to everybody.
Well, guys, there you go, ScottRitterExtra.com, and buy Scott's book. It's really great. And again, Scott, thank you so much. Pleasure speaking with you and having you on, as always.
Okay. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.